Hey now, today we're going to take a look at the Why Can't We Be Friends expansion for Imperial Settlers. Now actually, technically, this is called an Empire Pack, which leads me to believe, probably properly so, that there's going to be more of these coming out, more of these smaller expansion packs, and hopefully bigger expansions as well to add into your Imperial Settlers game. Now, if you don't know, Imperial Settlers was, I'd say it was a pretty big hit of last year. I'm not sure how well it sold, but I love it. It made it into my top 10 games of all time, because maybe it still had that new game aura around it, but it's phenomenal. It's exactly my kind of game. A card-driven game where you can use cards for multiple things, and you're building an empire, but it's relatively short for what it is. It has great artwork, graphic design. The text is really tiny, but other than that, it's a really solid game, and it's been a hit with a lot of people that I've showed it to. I've actually brought people into gaming and made people more of a gamerly gamers, as we like to call them, because of Imperial Settlers. So I was really eager to try the new expansion that came out, even though it is so small. Now, what this adds is new cards for all the decks in the game. So all 4 of the original faction decks get new cards. I think it's 10 particular cards, or 10 cards total for each of the faction decks, and then a bunch of cards for the common location card deck as well. And then there's 2 new cards that get added for solo play. And actually, in my original review of Imperial Settlers, I didn't cover solo play at all, but I wanted to try everything that came with this expansion, so I decided to play solo for the first time. I played a couple of games of it, so I'm going to have my impressions of that and how it's actually and how solo games actually work. I'll cover that in the overview just very briefly as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at the new stuff that comes in this expansion pack, and then I'll tell you what I think. Okay, we're just going to do a quick overview of all the new stuff that comes in the Why Can't We Be Friends expansion pack, or I should call it Empire Pack, for Imperial Settlers. As you can see, it adds new cards for all the different decks, all the individual faction decks, and the common card deck, as well as a couple of new cards for the solo mode, which I will explain as well, since I didn't cover that at all in my original Imperial Settlers review. Okay, let's start with the new common cards first. Now, first off, there's a new feature in this game called Open Production, and cards from the common deck and from the faction decks will have this feature. Essentially, this functions just like a normal production card, so you build the location, you're going to get the resource immediately, and then from then on in every round during your production phase, you'll gain the resource. You'll also gain the building bonus as normal for this card in particular, at least. But the catch here is that it actually introduces a new action to the game. On their turn, one of your opponents can take a worker, place it on this card, and they will gain the production. But so will you. That's one of the reasons the set is called Why Can't We Be Friends, because both players, the player who has the card and the player who is using the card, as with open production, will get that resource. But this can only be done twice per round, which means 2 workers will be placed total potentially on the card to signify that it has been used twice. And like I said, every deck is going to have cards like this. So here's another one, the Damascus Steel Armor. And this one is different because it has a built-in shield token. Shield tokens making it harder to raise it by 1. You need 1 more raise token in order to conquer it. You cannot double up on this and put another shield token on the card. Although if the Japanese faction gets this, they can protect it with the Samurai, meaning you'd have to have 4 raise tokens to destroy it. Here's the Food Market, which is another open production card, and the Stone Market for stone. Here's some other cards. Now, the Emma the Witch card has to do with the open production cards. Each time you send a worker to get open production, the person that you're taking the open production from does not get the other resource, so you're making it one-sided in that case. I guess you can't be friends after all. There's a few new cards in the common deck that are depot cards. These cards double as production and feature cards. You'll leave them up in your production spot. So you'll get the production as normal. So this one says you get a victory point for each wood moved to this card to a max of 3. And the feature is you get to move wood onto the card. So that's essentially what all the depot cards are. The Meat Market uses food instead of wood. And the Stone Depot uses, Meat Depot is what that was. And Stone Depot uses stone instead of the other ones. You have Bob's Building Team, which in the beginning of the lookout phase, you get to draw 2 faction cards, and instead of 1, keep one of your choice, and then reshuffle the other back into your deck, and you get a building bonus for that as well. Here's just a couple of interesting new cards. You have the Flea Market, which lets you spend essentially 2 of any resource to gain 2 victory points as an action. And then you have a weird anomaly in the deck. The only instant card, although of course there's a promise of more of them in future sets. The Volcano. There's only one card of this in the entire set. You mix it into the common cards as normal, and you can draft it from the lookout phase as normal. And essentially what it does, you have it. If a card lets you place a foundation directly into play, you can use it as a foundation, but otherwise, you essentially choose to use this card from your hand as an action, doing whatever it says. That's how all the instant cards will work. So in this case, you can discard the card to remove an enemy common faction, or just an enemy common location from the game, or discard this card and 2 raise tokens to remove 1 enemy faction card location from the game. So powerful effects, but again, there is only one of them. And the last card I'll show you is a new type of free ruins card, the Ancient Ruins. You build it, you get a stone, and then it's just nothing. You can use it to build something else, hopefully. Let's take a look at one of the faction decks. Here is the Roman faction. So another open production. You have the Loading Point, which is going to get you stone. The Cohort, which is a new type of card, which is going to let you spend a worker, this is an action card, to choose a common card from your hand and place it in your empire as a foundation. So this is where you actually get to place that instant card into your as a foundation instead of actually using it if you really wanted to do it that way. You have the Marble Merchant, which lets you use an action to spend 2 stone spend 1 stone to gain a coin, and that may be activated twice. And actually, I think every faction, or at least a couple of factions, has a card similar to that. The Hadrian's Wall lets you spend stone to move 1 common faction or common location card to the faction side of your empire. This location cannot be raised. So that lets you actually transform a common card into a faction card, essentially, once it's been built. New city feature, each time that you build a Roman faction, you gain a worker. Or actually, 1 worker. And I call them workers. I guess they're workers. I don't know if that's what their proper name is, but... And then finally, the Roman Embassy, you get to spend an action to spend a worker to choose 1 enemy production location and gain the goods that it provides. Next, we'll talk about the Japanese faction. All right, and for the Japanese faction, here's their version of the open production card, the Rice Granary, which gets you food. Then you have Takashi's Fishes. You get to use an action to spend 2 food to gain a coin and a victory point. You also gain a building bonus of a victory point for every red location in your empire. You have the Daimyo's Guards. As a feature, you can use Samurai to protect your common locations, whereas before you can only do that to faction locations. Building bonus, you get to put 2 workers down immediately as Samurai. The Lady Spy. As an action, you can spend a worker and a food to draw an enemy faction card, or 2 enemy faction cards. Choose 1 and make a deal with it. Shuffle the other one back in the deck. I think that's the first time something's letting you draw enemy faction cards, if I remember correctly. You have Kenji's Raiders. And what Kenji's Raiders says is that during the production phase, you get to draw a common location for each samurai in your empire to a max of 5. Keep one of those faction cards or location cards of your choice. Gain 1 or give 1 location card to an enemy and reshuffle the rest back into the deck. And the last one is the Great Journey card. As an action, you can spend a worker to name a card of a certain color, red, brown, or gray. Draw common location cards until you find one of the named cards, keep the card, and reshuffle the deck. So that's another interesting one to go card fishing with. Now let's take a look at the Egyptian cards. All right, we have gold, of course, for their version of the open production card. That's the treasury. Then you have the Ivory Sculptor. As an action, you can spend stone to gain gold. Like I said, I think every faction has, or most factions have some variation of that. The Egyptian Embassy, you can spend gold to immediately activate 1 enemy action space, or action location. You pay the regular cost to activate that location. That one's pretty powerful. The Cedars of Lebanon, as an action, you can spend a gold to gain 2 wood. And you get a building bonus. The Nile Merchants. During the production phase, you can choose 1 of your deals and gain the good it provides. And a building bonus, choose 1 of your deals and gain the good it provides. That's a pretty good one. And finally, the Gifts for the Pharaoh. During production, you can gain goods of the same number and type as the ones named on this card. And as a feature, you may store any number of resources and gold on this card. can be really powerful, actually. Let's take a look finally at the Barbarians. The Barbarians open production card gets you wood, the secluded hamlet, but also as a building bonus, you get a worker and a sword, a raise token, which is always good. That's usually what the Barbarians are good at. Captivity as a feature, each time that you raise, you gain 2 workers, or a worker, so just one, which essentially, so you're raiding and capturing people, which is pretty thematic, actually. The Rehousing Team. This is a funny card. As an action, you can spend 2 raise tokens to take 1 enemy common location from their empire into your hand, which is, and it's just funny artwork as well. Isn't murdering and pillaging fun? Mounted Scouts. As an action, you can spend a worker and a raise token to draw 2 common location cards. The Hall of Trophies. Production. 1 victory point for every raise token stored on this card to a max of 3. Feature, you may store any number of raise tokens on this card. And finally, the Elites. Production, 1 victory point for each location or each card underneath this location to a max of 3. Each time that you raise a location card from hand, you may put it underneath this location card instead of discarding it. All right, and the last thing we'll talk about are the new solo cards, and we'll go ahead and explain a little bit about how the solo game works. All right, so the solo game, just a really quick run through of how that works. You use the solo cards, which you actually will not use for anything else in the game except for the solo version of the game, and you're essentially battling a virtual player. Now, up until this expansion, Why Can't We Be Friends expansion, they are not associated with any faction, but there's a couple of cards that came with this that will let you do that. I'll get to that in a second, because they won't make any sense right now. But how this will work, most of the game feels the same as far as productions and actions for you, the player. The virtual player doesn't do any of that. But the lookout phase first is different. What you're going to do is you're going to draw 4 common cards from the common location deck, and you're going to take one of them. Then randomly from the remaining 3, the virtual player gets one of them face up into their play area, and then you take another one, and then the virtual player gets the last remaining card. Now, this is important because what you're trying to do here in order to win the game is have more faction locations than the number of total locations that the virtual player has. And at the end of every round of play, if the virtual player has any locations in their play area that were not raised or otherwise destroyed somehow or removed from the game, they claim those permanently as locations, essentially in a victory pile. You still score points in the solo mode, but you don't. It's just for your own benefit to try and see how well you did. It's just for, I guess, bragging rights or to try to make your game better over time. But you can outright win or lose depending on how many locations that you have. Now, most of your phase as the actual player, production and actions are going to be normal. And like I said, the virtual player is not going to do any of that stuff. But then once you've passed and you're done, then that player is going to attack, and that's where the cards come in. So at the start of the game, you're going to have 1 card that is going to be face up. And up here at the top, you have a little symbol that represents the target field. And now it's stone. So once at the end of the first round, when it comes time for the virtual player to attack, then you'll draw a second card and put it on top so that the target fields are showing. And now what you're going to do, the virtual player gets to attack twice. And what that means, you're going to look at the top card and what the symbol is. So in this case, it's a worker. Look at all of the cards that have raise fields, which is usually for most factions, it's going to be just the common cards. But the Japanese players' faction cards are also vulnerable if there had been a victory point symbol in the target field, and that is possible. So in this case, it's just a worker. So you would look at all of your common location cards and see if any of them had a worker in its raise field. With the raise field being the area of the card that depicts what resources you get if you were to raise it or if an opponent was to raise it. And if that's the case, if you see at least 1 card that has that in the raise field, then you're going to go to the next card after that and see if it matches up. So if you have a card in your empire that has a worker and a stone on it in the raise field, that card is going to get claimed by the virtual player. If not, then nothing happens and you go to the next round, but these cards stay out here. And that's how it's going to go. At the end of every round, you're going to draw more cards to put on top, which means that there are the amount of possibilities or the likelihood that one of your cards is going to get destroyed is going to raise, because every time there's going to be more cards for it to compare against. So you have a worker out here. All right, let's look at the cards. There's no worker in gold. Okay, well, now let's go to the next one. Is there 2 workers? No. Okay, well, is there a worker in a stone? Oh, there is. Okay, well, I'm going to kill it. And remember that this attack happens twice each turn, so you go through the whole thing. And if you do destroy a common card, those 2 cards get shuffled back to the back of the deck, so that there's always going to be potentially different location cards getting destroyed. Now, the new Why Can't We Be Friends expansion adds 2 cards that personalize the virtual player and make them into a faction, essentially, which before, like I said, they weren't. They're just sort of themselves, just the virtual player. Let's focus in on those a bit. And these just have the Barbarians and Romans, but it says in the book that future expansions will cover the other factions as well. So the Barbarians, during the virtual player's attack phase, they get to attack a 3rd time instead of just 2 times. And for the Romans, during the lookout phase, you draw 5 common locations instead of 4. Therefore, the virtual player gets to have 3 locations in the playing area instead of just the 2. So these essentially make the game more difficult. That's really what they are, as a way to make the solo game more difficult. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my final thoughts. But that is all the stuff, plus a little bit extra, talking about the solo mode that comes in Why Can't We Be Friends?
Okay, I've said this multiple times. I'm probably starting to sound like a broken record for some of these expansions that I review for various games. But this is one of the more expansions. It's just adding more stuff to the base game. That's its primary function. And if you love Imperial Settlers as much as I do, then that's going to be fine for you. I think that some people, not me, but some people have complained, I've seen on message boards and things, that Imperial Settlers can start to feel sort of samey after a little while, that you start playing with the factions over and over again, and you've seen all the cards, and you know the best combinations, and it can just start to feel sort of played out. Now, I'm not anywhere close to that point. I think before I got this expansion, I'd played Imperial Settlers maybe 6 or 7 times. I can't really remember right now, but and I always played with a different faction each time, and it still felt fresh and new to me. I always was discovering new card combinations, but I can see that happening eventually if you play it a lot. So it's good to have an expansion like this that adds more stuff into each of the decks, adds more variety. And there's 2 different ways that you can do this. You can simply just shuffle everything together. So take all the new cards, throw them right into the decks, the faction decks and the common deck, and just play that way. Or you can actually, it says for experienced gamers in the booklet, I guess, you can actually custom make your deck. So essentially what it is this: you choose which particular cards to use, and you always have to have the same amount of each one. So, or you have to use every copy of the card, I should say. So if there's a card and it has little indicators there that says there's 3 copies of this card in the deck, and you either want to use it or you don't want to use it, you have to take all of them out or put all of them in. That's how that works. So the way that we did it when we just really wanted to try the new expansion stuff was we took out, in particular, enough cards to put every new expansion card in and keep the deck small, but you could just shuffle everything together. That's entirely up to you. And so just for having this more variety, I think this expansion is really worth it. You can get it at Portal Games main store, I think, still, but it'll be commonly available soon. But let's go ahead and break down some of the new stuff that it does add. There's nothing earth-shattering in the set, I think. There's the potential to be eventually, but it doesn't really feel that way now. The biggest thing I would say is the open production. That is a new type of production card. It functions, as I explained in my overview, it functions the same as normal production, but now your opponents can use your open production up to twice per turn total. People can put their workers over there, and then they get the resource that it provides, and you do as well. That's why the set is called Why Can't We Be Friends? Now that's a cool little twist, and I kind of like it. And it adds a little more interaction to the game, which I thought kind of had enough interaction personally. But it's not groundbreaking. It's interesting, but it's just there. I could take it or leave it, to be completely honest. But I do like the fact that Imperial Settlers is branching out a bit and they're trying new things. And it makes me hopeful that there will be more new quirky little mechanics like that in the future. This set also introduced the idea of cards that had both production and feature abilities, like the depot cards from the common deck, which you can both produce this type of resource and then store it on the card. And then some of the different faction cards will behave differently by storing things on them, like the trophy card for the Barbarians, which lets you put raise tokens on that card instead, and I think get victory points for them, if I'm remembering correctly. There's one that lets you stow cards underneath it, location cards. So that's an interesting dynamic. I actually think that might be a little more interesting than the open production. But again, we're just talking about adding more variety to all of the different decks. The anomaly in this set is the instant card, the Volcano. And I actually think that I'm not going to play with that until there's more of them. Clearly, there's going to be more. There's going to be more of these instant cards. But I know it's not overwhelmingly powerful. It really isn't. It's fine. The first time someone used it in one of our games, they're like, oh, just destroyed my location. But it's not that big a deal. There's other cards that can destroy faction locations, or you can easily destroy common locations. So it's not a huge deal. But it just feels like this particular card sticks out like a sore thumb. So until there's more instant cards, I don't know. I'm not sure that I'm going to play with it. I might. Who cares? It's not that big a deal. But it feels odd that there's just one of them, I guess. And then there's the... well, I guess I should talk about there's the one particular card, the Damascus Steelworker, that has a built-in defense token. I would have liked to have seen more of that. I think that's actually kind of neat that there... And I would like to see where you could go with that as far as balance, like maybe a production location that isn't really all that good, but it's really hard to kill. That might be an interesting thing too, because in particular circumstances, that'd be really interesting. But anyways, the other thing is the solo game. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I hadn't talked about solo at all in my previous review because I hadn't tried it. Wasn't really interested in it. I was having a lot of fun just playing the game multiplayer, and I'm always a little leery of these strategy games that have the strategy competitive games that have a solo mode, like it's just tacked on. Even though this one came with a whole deck of cards, it still felt okay. So I went ahead and tried it because I wanted to try the new stuff in this expansion, and I enjoyed it. It's very interesting how it works. It's a little bit weird in the solo game with just the stuff from the base game. I think it's kind of easy. I mean, it's very random. You could just end up really screwed and have the right attack card combination come out for the virtual player that is just killing all of your stuff. And there's like, oh, God, I mean, what are you going to do about it? That's just going to happen. But then you're going to have a random game where, like, I played at least one game where, like, nothing was killed. And I happened to get enough production that I was getting tons of raised tokens. And at least as far as I interpreted the rules, that means you can just ping away at the location cards that happen to be out for the virtual player that turn and just kill them before he collects them. And then get the resources for them, which is even better. So I've had easy times with the game, and I've had some tough times with the game, but it just seems to be random. The two new cards that the Why Can't We Be Friends expansion adds makes it much more difficult, because now you're being attacked. There's only two of them. Again, it feels weird that they didn't just include all of them, like all four of the cards for the 4 different factions that released so far. But they just make it more tough. You're either being attacked more times, or they're starting with an edge, or starting with more cards and getting more faction cards each round. But I like that because I think it probably was overall, on average, too easy to begin with. Now it makes it a little bit trickier, gives a little edge to it, and I like that. And I'm surprisingly enamored with the solo game for this as well, although it probably speaks more to the fact that Imperial Settlers in general is just a fantastic game, and I want to play it whenever I can. So overall, really, really great expansion set. But it's nothing groundbreaking. I am waiting right now for the big set. I want there to be a big expansion. I'm sure it's on its way, that it has new factions, adds a ton of cards to the common deck and to the other existing faction decks as well, and maybe changes the game in some wildly unpredictable way that I hadn't predicted before. I don't think that change is a bad thing. And, I mean, if handled properly, I know that some games, like Race for the Galaxy, notoriously tried to add in new mechanics that just went over like a lead balloon. But I think it can be done right, and I think that this could be the game to do it. I'm waiting for that big expansion, but in the meantime, I will certainly take these smaller Empire packs. They are, this sounds really weird, but delicious appetizers in to the main course of Imperial Settlers. Okay, pretend I didn't say that. That is the Why Can't We Be Friends expansion Empire pack for Imperial Settlers.